This is a review of Dark Souls Design Works, which was originally published in Japanese but has since been given an English translation and release by Udon Entertainment. And I have to apologize for the glare that we're going to see on these first 30 pages. They're on a high gloss black paper, and I tried a couple of different setups, but the lighting just did not want to work with me. But the book will switch to white pages in a little bit and go back to normal. Also, I wouldn't be too worried if the glare is making things hard to see, because these black pages are by far the least interesting in the book. So this is the English version by Udon, and I'm a really big fan of the video game art books they do. Even though they're not actually responsible for creating the books themselves, they just do the English translations and releases of usually Japanese video game art books, which I know I really appreciate, because there are a lot of great video game art books that are released exclusively in Japan, and it can be kind of hard to get hold of those if you live outside of the country. And so if you're familiar with any of the sort of books that Udon has done in the past, things like Monster Hunter, Bloodborne, Dragon's Dogma, you'll know the general sort of both the sort of general style of the art direction and the sort of layout of the book, which is a little bit different to the sort of Western art books you might be used to. But the main thing that impressed me about, say, those books that I just mentioned is just how comprehensive and overflowing with artwork they were. But unfortunately, that is not something that can be said for this book, which is really the book's only weakness, but it is a particularly major one in this instance. It's only about 120 pages, not all of which feature art, and then those that do don't always use that limited space to the best advantage. And so, as outstanding as many of the works actually are in this book, the overall experience is quite underwhelming, unfortunately. And I'm kind of in two minds about how much I want to emphasize that point, because on the one hand, I don't want to suggest this is an awful book or anything, because it's absolutely not. But on the other hand, I do feel it can be potentially disappointing, especially considering that it's quite expensive. Now, price is not usually something I talk about in my reviews, because I just figure that depending on where you are in the world, where you're buying it from, when you're buying it, the price of a book can vary so wildly. But in general, this book, like all of Udon's books, tend to run a little bit unnecessarily expensive. But if that's not really an issue for you, or especially if you are a huge Dark Souls fan, this is probably something you're going to want, especially if you sort of want to have the full collection of all three art books for the Dark Souls games. And there probably is quite a bit in here for you to enjoy, just as long as you understand it's going to be more of a snack rather than the feast you might otherwise be expecting. But if you're more of a casual fan of the game, or a collector of art books, or just someone who's interested in fantasy art, I really would suggest you pay very close attention to the flip through for this one, and really make sure you feel it has enough to interest you, especially because there are so many other art books that will offer a more fulfilling experience for a cheaper price. However, if from this flip through you are a little unimpressed, you should still definitely check out the review for the Dark Souls 2 art book, which will be up next week, as that is a much, much better book on all fronts. And then in terms of other art books you might be interested in, actually, first, I do want to talk about the text. As I'm sure you can see as we're going through, there's really not any text beyond sort of like titles. There's no captions or commentary accompanying anything. Instead, all of the text is actually in the back of the book, presented in long-form interviews, which is sort of interesting and weird, and I definitely see some advantages to presenting the text in this way. However, I don't think it outweighs the disadvantages, and I think it would have been a much smarter decision had they sprinkled the interview text throughout the book, sort of in more of a traditional sense that you might be used to with art books, having a little bit of commentary and text on each page. But the interviews are interesting and certainly help in adding more value to the book. And then what was I saying? The other art books. So the limited collector's edition for the first Dark Souls game came with an art book, but it's one of those, those little sort of small crappy hardcovers that are only 46 pages or something, and so it's like even a significantly worse version of this book. I never like those sort of books. They're always so sort of small potatoes that they're really only of value to the most sort of hardcore completist. But while we're on the subject of crappy art books that come with collector's editions, there was a similar one that came with Demon's Souls, which is, I guess, worth mentioning because, Dark Souls is sort of a successor to that. And then I guess also Udon's Bloodborne art book called Bloodborne Official Artworks is also probably worth mentioning, as they also share that sort of, JRPG dark fantasy style. And then actually coming out in May is a book called Dark Souls Cover Collection, which is a collection of the covers from the Dark Souls comic books. But I had a look at the product information and it says it's only 96 pages, so I was like, I don't know about that. But if you're a big Dark Souls fan, it might be something you're interested in. But then in terms of concept art from the first Dark Souls game specifically, there's also the Dark Souls Trilogy art book, but I'll actually talk about that book in a little more detail next week when I review the vastly superior Dark Souls 2 design works.